All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the Community Connection in Times of Crisis webinar. As people continue to sign on and introduce themselves in the chat room, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We do have a lot of people on the call today. We have community foundations joining us from all across the country, as well as from Canada and Mexico. So thank you all so much for joining us. We do ask that you leave your microphone and your video off while our speakers are presenting. If you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can contact my colleague Caroline and she can help you troubleshoot. If we all have technical issues, we will switch to phone. The phone number is here on the screen and we will email everyone if we have to switch to phone, but we haven't had any issues with Zoom so far. And I just wanted to remind everyone, or for those of you who are new to these webinars, we do record each webinar. You can find all of our previous recordings on our website under the resources section. We also have a couple of recent blog posts that we encourage you to read. We are collecting statements made by community foundations across the country, again, speaking out against anti-Black racism. If you want to submit your statement to our blog post, you can just send me an email and I'm happy to add it for you. We also just posted today about ABFI's imperatives for philanthropy, encouraging the philanthropic community to take action against anti-Black racism. And Deborah will speak to that more in a moment. And with that, I will turn it over to Deborah to get us started and to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Melody, and welcome everyone. We're really glad you all could join us here today. We want to thank you for joining us in this special edition of our Community Connections in Times of Crisis webinars. We've been hosting this online forum since the early days of the coronavirus for community foundations who want to come together to hear how your community foundation colleagues are navigating the public health crisis and the economic devastation we're now experiencing. So now another crisis, long ignored, has gained widespread attention in communities coast to coast after a video that showed a white Minneapolis police officer killing George Floyd, a Black man, by pressing his knee to his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Mr. Floyd pleaded, said he couldn't breathe, and called for his mother. The video, like so many before it, really provided a horrifying visual depiction of the crushing weight of the racism we're seeing. Dozens of community foundations from communities across the country and the world, and from metropolises to rural areas, have spoken up, expressing their own pain, anger, frustration, and commitment to do better. We at CF Leads have more than 50 statements on our websites and our own statement, and we know that things are not okay. Living with, tolerating, or perpetuating racism is not okay. Black people are not okay. But as community foundations, what do we do? How do we take this worldwide attention on police brutality specifically and on systemic racism more broadly and help work for a better future? How can we ensure that things will really improve for people of color this time? What actions can community foundations take? And how can we seize this really important moment? So first, I want to echo some of the things that Melody highlighted. I want to highlight the Association of Black Foundation Executives has issued a state of recommendations for philanthropy in this moment. It's on our website and on theirs, of course, and we'll forward it along, excuse me, with the recording of this webinar. Please read it, do what you can, and please join ABFI so that they can build the capacity they need to support the field right now. Second, it's more important than ever to listen. In this case, the protests are stimulating a great reimagination of our systems, in fact, greater than the response to the coronavirus, which exposed stark racial disparities. So no matter what you think of the calls for completely dismantling police, that level of creative thinking is now on the table. And this radical reimagination is something Angela Blackwell, the founder of PolicyLink, has been advocating for some time. We really need to listen to be able to think big. Finally, we can always learn from each other as community foundations, and that's why we're offering this webinar today. We know the killing of George Floyd is not unique. This kind of brutality is familiar across the country. We're lifting up the Minneapolis Foundation because it was the atrocity in their community that has sparked the worldwide response, and because they've been at this for some time. Today, we're going to hear from R.T. Ryback, who's the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, and Shauna Baker-Smith, who's the senior vice president for community impact. R.T. joined the Minneapolis Foundation as its 7th president and CEO in 2016. Prior to that, he served as mayor of Minneapolis for 12 years, often collaborating directly with the foundation, specifically on issues addressing youth violence and employment. Directly before stepping into the role of president and CEO at the foundation, he served as executive director of Generation Next, a public-private coalition focused on closing education gaps for kids of color. RT has also served as a senior advisor for municipal practice at Living Cities. Shauna Smith-Baker joined in 2017, and prior to joining the foundation, she served as president and CEO of Pillsbury United Communities, where she oversaw 5 neighborhood centers, a training center, and social enterprises. Before taking the helm at Pillsbury in 2011, she served as its chief learning officer, and prior to that as vice president of strategic partnerships, director of government and community relations, and director of the Oak Park Neighborhood Center. Both RT and Chandra are lifelong Minneapolis residents. So welcome, RT and Chandra. We're really glad you both have really given your time here, because we know how many extraordinary demands you have in your time. So thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much. And we realize the imperfections of being outside. I'm sorry, a plane is going on. But I just want to say how much we appreciate this opportunity to be with our colleagues. It has been a really difficult time, and it is a time for a lot of reflection. So we want to do that with our colleagues. I want to give a special shout out to Eric Friend, who I just saw came on from the Morelos Community Foundation in Mexico. Morelos is a city in Mexico where many people originate from who come to Minneapolis. We're in a mapping project with you, and thank you for being here. What we want to do over the next few minutes is give a context of how we've been working on this issue since the murder of George Floyd. But it's important to remember we didn't just kind of wake up to racial equity when George Floyd was murdered by one of our police officers. For decades, the Minneapolis Foundation's been working on equity and racial equity, and that's both a statement we're proud of and one that is pretty difficult to say when we face what we are facing right now. And so it's really important to start at that point. It's also important to say that when I came to the foundation, I felt it was especially important for us to be more than just an ATM for dollars going in and out of the community, but to become more of a community of generosity. So really focused on this idea about how do the one-on-one relationships we have become part of a community. And when I looked for a person who could lead us through that, to lead all of our impact, it was unquestionably the one best person in the community to me was Shauna Smith-Baker. Shauna and I had collaborated very early in her time and at Pillsbury, or in leading Pillsbury, a few days after she became part of it, in the middle of a community meeting after a tornado in a very fractious situation. I turned to Shauna and asked her to lead the response. And so we, in partnership, ironically, with the Minneapolis Foundation, navigated through that. And it's one of many times where I saw her incredible work. When we began talking about the job, she said, I want to work on criminal justice reform. And so I want to turn it over to Shauna to talk just a little bit about how we got into that whole body of work. And that's a setup for what we've been able to do since. So Shauna, can I turn it over to you?
For sure. So again, thank you for everyone for attending and your interest in this conversation. As RT mentioned, as part of my role into the Minneapolis Foundation, I was very committed to criminal justice reform and looking at issues of how we build safer communities. How do we address both community level violence and how do we improve kind of the issue of mass incarceration and the challenges of police community relations. And as a result of that, we hired a fellow last year. We've been working on bail reform. We've held summits. We've done a number of things relative to that. The one that I want to raise up that I think is important for this conversation is after the last election, we had Attorney General Keith Ellison, who is our first African-American Attorney General of the state, and our Commissioner of Public Safety, John Harrington, who is a former police chief, wanted to put together a working group on police-involved deadly encounters. And they came to the foundation because they knew that not only had we been working on this issue, but that this was an issue that both of us had a point of view on and had been deeply engaged in, to see whether or not the foundation would have an interest in being the funder to support that table. And additionally, would I have a willingness to sit at that table for the 10 months in which we did learning sessions and debrief sessions over a 10-month period. That work produced a report that came out in February that that brought forth 28 recommendations on how to improve, or I should say, how do we reduce the number of police-involved deadly incidents and improve officer accountability. And so this, in fact, has been a body of work. What I would like to say, and maybe bounce back to RT, is that you know, while this was a personal commitment of mine, it was accepted and supported by the community, by the Minneapolis Foundation. And during this same period of time, we were really thinking deeply around how do we think about equity and justice and the opportunities differently than what we have to date as we were going through our new strategic framework. And so in that, we really lifted up, what does it mean for us to be proximate to an issue? What does it mean for us to be in relationship with community as we develop our strategies? And how does this need to evolve the way that we see our success?
So as we began to do that work, it became clear to the rest of the community that we were leaning into this in a much more personal way. And right as that was rolling out, there was a police shooting in the community. But in this case, it was a Somali officer who shot and killed a white woman. And the legal settlement wound up directing $20 million. One of the things that, as the city council and mayor were making that decision, and they realized that with all of the incredible inequities in policing, now we had a major financial settlement where a white woman was getting $20 million and so many African-American victims hadn't. So not being able to right that wrong, they did direct $2 million to foundation, to our Fund for Safe Communities. And then Shauna set up a really incredible process over more than a year, working with emerging leaders, primarily of color, primarily young people who had had experience with police violence, who were about to put the first $500,000 of this money out. When the Floyd murder took place, she then led the team to put another $500,000 in. Before we move on, Shauna, do you want to amplify that at all? I was going to touch on the police thing, but anything else on that part you want to touch on?
I think it just goes to the orientation that we have as leaders at the foundation, and the importance that we recognize that we cannot move the needle on anything if we don't understand it from the people that have directly experienced it. So that advisory that RT is mentioning is led by a young leader, Brandon Williams, who is a recent college grad. He's in his early 20s. We have 8 other young leaders. That includes one person that who has a brother that was involved with the deadly incident. We have people that have been victims of violence in their family, and those, and we have 2 offenders that have now really made some significant efforts towards turning their life around. And so they are informing me not just on granting decisions, but they are informing me and talking to me about some of the strategies that we are going through. So I think what's important to lift here is, despite my significant experience, both personally and professionally dealing with these issues, that I knew that I still had blind spots, and that was important for me to round out that experiences with the people that are closest to it.
So when George Floyd was murdered, we needed to move on several fronts. And as you can imagine, we weren't necessarily emotionally in the best spot. I personally, Minneapolis is as part of me as I could possibly say, and seeing my city burning, seeing a police department that I had overseen have one of their officers murder someone in the uniform. I mean, there was a lot going on, but immediately we had to obviously jump into that response. Our donors, as you can imagine, went very quickly to tangible things. How do we build something? How do we help a business, which is super important. And we have worked with them on that. But what we really needed to do is say a couple things. Number one, part of this is to, and I think Deborah, in your introduction, talking about listening differently was important. So Shauna and I did a webinar somewhat similar to this, but really getting into the police reform issues last week and asking people before they started writing checks or doing something, just begin to go through this base of knowledge. We're going to stay with them on that. There were also some really tactical things that needed to be done with the police department. Criminal justice reform is the macro frame we've been working on, but we have to reform the Minneapolis police, and it involves some very tough things, including union leadership, contract negotiations. I know a lot about that. I know a lot about what's wrong about it. And Shonda's been in the weeds with that whole committee doing the work. So we decided we're going to lean into this really heavily. But one of the things we had to do was to take on a union leader in a pretty big way. So I worked with the board and said, okay, I want to write a piece about this. I wrote one that really named the union leader as a real problem, and we agreed that that was best on my private blog. But then we would use the foundation to talk about more systemic change. We have a reform-minded police chief, the first African-American chief in Minneapolis. Shauna and I have known him for years. We came out foursquare and backed that chief and have said to him privately and publicly, we'll give you whatever help you need. We're giving him expertise on helping to develop a better contract. We're bringing in technology that will help him better track early intervention for police officers, and we're involved in other very tactical things like that. So this broad body of criminal justice is enhanced by some really direct work in policing. So that's sort of a setup for this. Deborah, should we dive into questions now?
Sure, unless is there anything else you want to tell us about any of the sort of the roles that you think have been particularly important for community foundations, what makes them uniquely qualified to step in on this?
Yeah, so I think I'll take that. I think, so one, hopefully the community foundations are more nimble and have an opportunity to be more responsive. I also think that we hold multiple truths within a community foundation so that we can work with both the community and the police chief and the mayor and the attorney general. Like, we are basically convening conversations around the same issues from different perspectives so that we understand where the gaps are, where the opportunities are, and that we can support folks getting to the same, to hopefully the same priorities. I think that it's not just about community foundations. I think, to RT's point, it also is about having, I think, people that work in community foundations that have an understanding and relationships in the community, because it's very challenging to build credibility in a moment. And if you're not thinking about your relationships before an incident, it's going to be very difficult for you to be credible in the moment that you're most needed. We've often talked about in RT, I will push back every now and then on some of the.
Never.
I push back every day. But I think that, that we have boards and we have a sector, an ecosystem that is really had been focused on what is your impact? Like, what did this dollar get me? what did, you know, like how close did we, you know, line up to the plan that we had at the beginning of the year? And, you know, not only do I work here, but I've sat on a number of boards, United Way, I sit on the Women's Foundation board, and I've been involved with strategic planning. And I'll use one example from someone outside of the foundation. Our foundation is that at the beginning of the strategic plan, we laid out some things, and we weren't talking about immigration. And then there was an election, and then immigration and travel bans were like a really big deal. And so from just the beginning of the plan to before the plan was posted, the entire community felt like it had evolved and the issues had changed. And so where I think we've done our best work is when we've been able to respond, not meaning that we're distracting at all from the plan that we had in place, but we build trust by being able to respond quickly and pull things together. And so since December, here in Minneapolis, we had a significant fire in a Drake hotel where there was a number of homeless folks that were previously homeless that were being housed there, over 200 people that we stepped in and did the recovery on. Then we're all living through COVID, in which we had to reorganize our whole shop and come home and deal with that pandemic and the economic and personal health, you know, consequences of that. And then now we're in George Floyd, and we've been front and center in all three of those, and none of those were planned. And all of that is in addition to the work. And so, you know, I think the reality is that we, if doing the work in the way that I think and we think that community foundations can act, is that we're able to do that in a way that certainly causes some angst and stretch and capacity and all those issues, but we see it as our responsibility.
Mhm.
And this is a really difficult conversation with our board. We have a wonderful board, but they're very used to a very rigid theory of change. We will employ X number of hard to employ adults over the next 7 years. We will do X number, you know, these very tangible things. Well, none of those things that Shauna mentioned were on our radar. And for us to do that, it's going to be a heck of a lot harder. So we're in this really difficult conversation about what are metrics, how do they quote unquote hold us accountable, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we're delivering tremendous value to the community. But for all of you, I mean, I think we're very interested in your journey on that too, because I came in as a really big data and analytics guy, and I think, you know, I've evolved quite a bit as I've worked with Shauna, and we've thought about that. But the board's evolution is a little different, and that's tough for us.
Well, let me jump in with a question there that someone submitted in advance. So, you know, we did ask all of you to submit questions in advance because we had so many participants in this webinar. And as you can imagine, a lot of them had kind of a few common themes. So if you don't mind, what I will do is I'll state the question and then the person who offered it. And in case you don't remember exactly what you wrote, I'll ask the question and you can jump in and turn your video on and turn your audio on and refine or follow up. So Janelle Hines from Milwaukee has really wants to know a little bit more about how community voice has really how it has influenced your response. So Shauna, you talked about bringing in a team. But what was it that you heard that shaped your response? And Janelle, if you're there, if you want to and are willing to, if you want to turn your video on and turn your audio on, then they can speak directly to you.
Yeah, hi Janelle. So one is that RT hired me, a person that already has that orientation. And so I do think that in making deliberate and intentional decisions, having people that are oriented towards listening and engaging in community voice, I think is one way. So it may not be someone in my role, but there's likely someone in every community foundation that has their ear to the ground. And I think that it's important that they are seen as a conduit between community and the actions that your foundation are taking. You know, the other thing is that we are both extremely connected in community. So even when we don't want to hear from folks, they reach out to us anyway. And that's just what it is. So whether or not it's my neighbor coming over and saying, what are we talking about defunding the police? Or when we were right in the middle of the riot my phone was just going crazy. Are we safe? What's happening? And so I can pull from that. So what I would say is, because we are that embedded and connected, and those connections go beyond our T&I. We have a team of people that work at the foundation that really have solid relationships in community. As a result of that, our connection and bringing in community voice goes beyond the focus group and the survey.
Mhm.
That you will get one data set from that. It's no different than any other sort of human-centered design, or if you've seen the IDEO video, like you can ask someone what issues they're having with technology and they'll tell you one thing, and then you watch them go through it and you observe something else. And so I think being able to be a good observer, to have good connections, and then to have formal process that brings that voice in. So for me, for the advisory committee, which is just one formalized way in which we are getting feedback, it was bringing in someone in their early 20s that understands better how violence is working in community and what the experience is. You know, I'm 5th generation in the community. Janelle, it would be, I don't know how well you know Minneapolis, but it would be similar to, I don't know, I think it's North Division in Milwaukee, or where North used to be, the high school
Okay,
used to be,
I'll
but
give you credit for that. That was good.
so it's
That's
very
impressive.
comparable to that. And you know, I still live in the neighborhood, and even with that, and the 5 kids that I'm raising, and 4 of them are boys, I don't know everything.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important orientation, that even with my proximity, I am super clear that I do not have a generational understanding. I don't have a gendered understanding. You know, I may not even have a geographical understanding, because the neighborhoods are quite diverse, even where I live. So I think that, you know, recognizing where your blind spots are, that informs your hiring and your engagement is very important.
Any
So I-
follow-up, Janelle?
That did, and actually your work with criminal justice reform and the group you led by Brandon Williams, I think you said his name, was also another example of the type of work that I was hoping that you were doing. But I'm curious, this is my last follow-up question. Artie, you mentioned value add to the community and the board wanting to measure it. How do you pull in community voice to identify what value you're adding and sharing that as impact with the board?
You know, this is a really interesting question, because there are 2 trains running in philanthropy, and they're not on the same tracks at all. One is the idea of a very data-driven approach. And there's a version of Robin Hood and Tipping Point that just started in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that's very much about looking at data and analytics and all that. I came out of I built results metrics into everything from paving to equity in the fire department, into results measures for the city. I believe in that. When I did work in between being mayor and this, I worked in the Strive Collective. And in that, we actually looked at 3 concentric circles. Data and analytics is an important one. So is the anecdotal experience that happens around the country. And so, most important, is what happens in community. And so I try to hold those 3 things in my head at the same time, because I do think there are things we can learn from data and analytics, but I want predictive analytics. Like, what are ways that we can move forward and get something done, as opposed to forensic. Nobody needs to tell me there's an equity issue in Minneapolis. Yes, I know that. I need to understand through the data where to go, but I also need to ask the people who are on the ground doing the work or living there, what is your lived experience? And a final point, I'm on a board of a similar to the Promise neighborhoods, Northside Achievement Zone in town. And in one of our board meetings, I think it's okay to say this, I wouldn't spread it around too much, one person said, we've really got to do more data, and gave this really rigid point about that. And I got that we needed to make the case with data. But a woman who is on the board and is one of the parents in this said, how dare you try to summarize my life in a couple data points? This organization has changed my life. That's all I need to know. And I believe we can and need to navigate both.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Janelle?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So another person asked kind of a similar kind of question or follow on. So Sandy Berry Loken, I don't know if you are on the webinar, from Kalamazoo, but she asked, you know, if there were any particular institutional policies that have kind of slowed you down right now? Is there stuff that you're having to overcome? Is there stuff within the board, whatever, that are slowing down your ability to respond? So Sandy, I don't know if you are actually on here. I'm looking here if you're on the webinar.
I can't see your face, Shauna. I'm wondering which one of us want to take this one.
Oh, gosh.
She doesn't look like she made it on, but she
Okay.
registered. So go ahead.
Well, let's do this one together. So I do think I do think that point about it's been very difficult moving onto what are the metrics. That's a big piece of it. I think it's also been one to, and Shauna's in the middle of this. Maybe I should turn it over to you, to this whole issue of the moving away from them approving grants into helping us move forward. Maybe you're better at that one. Why don't you talk about that?
So I have what I'm thinking, so I'm just going to say it, and that is that philanthropy is a privileged space, and folks with privilege and organizations that have had privilege also believe that they have the answers. And so there's an evolution, I think, that goes with Janelle's question on within it, and how do we value the experiences and nuances of the work versus kind of our need to set the stage and understand how the outcome, like in this very linear way where community work is not linear, it's actually quite chaotic in a way. And so I think it's us coming to the reality that we can't just have a theory of change in which we have our own sort of theory, hypothesis, and then we go out and we have our measurements and then we report back on it, because that's what we've been doing collectively, and it hasn't moved the needle in almost any community. And so I think that I don't know if the policies are where the barriers are. I think it's more of a philosophy and an orientation that so RT had mentioned, like, even the metrics. I think that for us, it's been how do we manage change? How do we reorient not just our board, but our staff and ourselves to a model that both can communicate success in our efforts and what the impact and the lessons learned. So how do we use data not to just tote success, but to inform our strategies? You know, how do we do that in a way that meets both of those needs? The desire to know that our efforts are going towards good things and achieving, but also knowing that things don't often work in a straight and narrow way. So I think the philosophical pieces, you know, when you engage community, you need to have platforms of engagement. So your technical tools need to evolve. The capacity, how time spent, you know, staff are spending their time evolves, and how you measure. And all of that only works if you have agreement on the direction that you're turning in. So, you know, over the time that we've been working on our strategic framework, I would say that is the biggest thing, of people moving away from how they think the work should work to where we're trying to take the work to. And we've had some success in there. And I think the most complicated place, as RT mentioned, has been in our evaluation.
I also think there's a certain degree of being victim of your own success by freeing ourselves from this rigid theory of change and saying we were going to take on a couple big community issues each year. Criminal justice reform and education equity are the two we're in right now. And by responding to all of these, and by the way, during this whole period of time, doubled the amount of money that comes in and out of the foundation, from 40 million in and out a year to, we raised 107 million this year and put out 90 so far. You know, so a lot is going on. When you put that up against a board looking at that, the question is, well, you're all over the map. No, we're actually all over town in a way a community foundation should be. And we're doing dramatically more. But that's, and I'm not saying everybody on the board feels that way, but we could slow down. We could say, gee, let's not take on education equity until next year. I'm not prepared to do that because I'm not prepared to have another year of kids losing the equity in their classroom that we do. I'm not prepared to just look at the George Floyd situation and do okay. So, I mean, you're looking at two really exhausted people representing a completely exhausted team that's getting a lot done. And yet making sure that we're able to pull it all up is not as big a question as making sure we're able to explain it, I think.
Yeah.
And
Can I add one more thing, Deborah? And that is that I think part of the conversation that has been a challenge. So I'll talk about the privilege. You know, I talked a little bit about that, but I think the other thing is, and you raised this up in your opening, Deborah, around COVID-19 has really made it plain and obvious for all of us, as did the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath, the level of disparity and the structural racism that exists in our country. And we have spent a lot of time talking about, if we're not getting to those structural issues, we are working on a symptom and not the problem. And so in order for us to go deeper into that racial construct, the historical construct, and understand where we have been complicit might be one way, or how we can be supportive to ending the practices that have harmed community and caused the disparity. It requires us to do our own work individually in the foundation, and it requires people to really take a look. It is nearly impossible to talk about structural racism without people centering themselves at some point in that conversation on, you know, am I a racist? Am I not a racist? Like, I mean, it gets deeply personal. And I think that that's part of the challenge. And we have also started a convening series called Conversations with Shauna. Our team really pushed for that, in which we've been convening.
I made her call it after. It wasn't her, it's an ego thing. I said, we got to have it. You're the person to lead the conversation.
Yeah. And so we have a podcast and we have other things. And the first two conversations out the gate were on white fragility and decolonizing wealth.
Just little topic.
Little topics. And we've had a number of conversations around police reform, including from Ron Davis, who led 21st Policing in the Cops Department under the Obama administration. So I'm saying that to say that you can't just work on the symptom. You really need to do the deeper work. And we are doing the deeper work and putting in structures into the foundation. Matter of fact, today there was a diversity, equity, inclusion lunch and learn, where they dug into the Tulsa riots and what is behind that and what leads the communities to that point. And so, you know, you have to work at all levels and use all your levers, but understand that there's a deeper level or deeper dive into the work, because it's not just external. It's not how do you fix the community? It is, what do we need to do to be in relationship with community in a way that honors equity, inclusion, and justice.
And we found that with our equity networks too. People are working internally and externally, and some people go external first, or some foundations go external first, some go internal first, and it seems to be, it's a back and forth. But other specific things, I mean, you mentioned the lunch today or the staff meeting today. Are there specific things you've been doing? Are there specific things you've been doing with regards to your board? And in fact, I actually might refer to someone, John Fisher. I don't know if you are on. Let me see if you are. It doesn't look like he is. Oh, yes, you are. John Fisher. He is a board member from our friends to the north at the Calgary Foundation, and he is wondering how boards begin to start applying an anti-racism analysis. So George, I don't know if you're willing to turn on your video or John, excuse me, turn on your video and your mic, and they can respond to that. Just sort of what's the work you've done with your board?
You want me to go? John, I'm sorry, I paused because I thought you were going to add something. We have, in some places, been very explicit in that conversation. In other ways, we have talked about it in terms of bringing in community voice. How do we get more proximate to the issue? How do we challenge our own thinking? What are the lessons and learnings and commitment to our own development as a board do we need to take on? And so I think it's been two-part. I don't think that we have talked about it explicitly as the question was asked, John. but I do know that, you know, part of it has been our own undertaking, and part of it has been the context in which we're living in. So when COVID hit, when the Drake hit, you're talking about housing inequities. Now you're talking about health inequities and the economic impact and the difference between who's being impacted by COVID, what the long-term projections are, and then now George Floyd. And so I think that the context in which we're living in has allowed for hardly no one to turn their head and not know what's happening, right? And so as a result of that, we are watching board members that maybe weren't all the way tapped in, at least have a renewed sort of curiosity or deeper comfort level in raising those questions, asking those questions, and reaching out. But it's an evolution. I think going for a board that was really talking about impact from an evaluative framework to the deeper work, and then bringing up words like anti-Blackness, you know, that's a journey that might take a few more months. What say you, RT?
Yeah, well, I would say that where we've done it well, I think, is internally. We redid the HR position and created a person over that called Director of Talent and Culture, which we have a plan, as Shonda mentioned. The luncheon today is part of a really good internal plan, and we are at a very early stage with taking the board to that. We know we need to. We've been trying to focus so much on our strategic framework. We really haven't made the time for that, and we know full well that we would be a lot further along if we had and when we do.
Great, thank you for that.
Any follow-up, John?
I was just thinking about what you said earlier about measurement and what you measure and how it's important. But I also appreciated Shonda's comments about the work of the foundation institutionally, the self-reflectiveness, but looking internally and externally at the same time. So I really appreciated those comments, and I thought you were answering my question.
You know, one thing that I'm excited about what we've done is one of the principles of our framework is internal mirrors external. And I mentioned earlier that we're trying to create a community of generosity where our donors work together. So one of the things we've done is to recognize that most of the staff does not have resource to have a donor fund at the Minneapolis Foundation. So what we've done is we opened a DAF for every member of the team, put $500 in that'll accrue at the end of the year. The reason at the end of the year instead of now is because between now and then we're going to have monthly, it's not an optional lunch and learn, it's a monthly impact meeting. And it's not us saying what are the groups that we believe in or even the impact team. It's every member of the team bringing in, you know, we'll have 3 or 4 a meeting where they'll each say, I believe in this group, I believe in that, and make the case for that. Then at the end of the year, people can give the dollars wherever they want. So we're modeling the kind of community we want to have. And we're trying to also take those people on our team who don't work in impact and who aren't out in the community all the time to understand that not only is their work connected to it, but as part of working there, you get money to give away that will hopefully give you insight into how we're trying to work with donors.
Yeah, I think I have one additional thing to add, and RT goes from, you know, our internal matches, external, or at least our desired external, is that the work that we did on our values really have evolved. And our core values, and I honestly don't remember what they were before because I love the new ones so much, so I just erased them from memory. But I think that they were like, you know, integrity, relationships or collaboration, those types of words. They have evolved to things like our internal will match our desired external. Hope is essential. Proximity is necessary. Equity is a responsibility. And so based on your question, the last question, is that where we're not maybe hitting kind of the popularized language, or if you will, you know, we don't even have really a lot of words like equity and inclusion written into our framework. And we talked a lot about, it's one thing to put it in your language. Frankly, those words are getting so watered down that if you're not doing anything else to prove that you're doing it, it doesn't matter. But we evolved our language. Equity is a responsibility, and that you know, what does it mean for us to live those values, not to expect those values? And the board signed off on them and actually were very engaged. What does it mean for hope to be essential, right? Like, you know, in order to have hope, you have to believe there's something different. And if we're not doing that for our communities, if we're not doing that for individuals that are being impacted by our work, our donors that are being impacted by the work, because we know, you hear people, I have put money into education for all these years, you know, so how do you maintain a sense of hope and possibility in the midst of some really complicated and historical challenges?
Mhm. Thank you.
Does that get your question answered, John?
Very much,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. Now we had a couple of questions that were a little bit more externally facing and kind of what kind of tactics you're using. And some are very specific, but one from Erin Talbert Brust from the East Bay Community Foundation. Doesn't look like she's on the call, but a really interesting question. If social justice and police accountability is the catalyst for current events, how are you supporting movements and sharing stories? How is that a part of your work, if it is at all?
Yeah. Do you want to start that, Shauna?
Yeah, so the catalyst to current events was the murder of George Floyd. So I don't necessarily agree with the premise of the question. And I think that the current events, which include protests and rioting across the world, is, I think, an outcry collectively of enough is enough. We can't take it anymore. And all the other things that go when people feel like there has been no justice and there's no accounting for the atrocities that are happening within communities that appear to be not as important. And so if the question is, how are we taking that seriously this moment? I think the response is that we instantly supported one of the protests. It went viral actually with Tamika Mallory coming in. We supported that rally with Stephen Jackson. We helped pull that together. We held conversations around it. We've talked internally. We put money out the door. We're meeting regularly with the police chief and our mayor. We're meeting regularly with the governor's team, our attorney general, and our commissioners and our legislators as they are looking to move reforms. And so we have, we are moving where we need to go. We did not spend time in the conference room talking about what we should do for months. We started to move. We knew what we needed to do. We've had experience coming in when crisis hits. We leveraged our relationship and the trust that was already built. The network's already there for us to say we need to be part of leadership of making this not happen again.
It's also important to mention that we've been funding civic engagement for a long time. Economic vitality, education, and civic engagement. And that civic engagement portfolio is a very grassroots group. Shauna, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think pretty much everybody's supporting, every major organization supporting abolition of the police department we fund, even though we don't support abolition of the police department. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and actually, yeah, we're not abolitionists, but we certainly stand with them on radical transformation of the system of policing. It is about individual police that are exhibiting behavior that's contrary to what we know policing should look like. But this is about a system that has upheld those people within those departments for far too long. And we absolutely agree that that should not be the case. And we also obviously support having improved mental health services, improved relationships, and along those lines, and stopping the school to prison pipeline. And so there's lots of places in which we agree, but I think, again, the benefit is that we can hold lots of opinions and knowing that they're all headed towards the same direction, which I really have appreciated as part of our leadership.
Well, and that this relates to another question of Chris Barge had, who's from Boulder, who was on a minute ago, but I see he's not on anymore. It sounds like you have taken a stand on things like defunding the police or dismantling the police. And is that, number one, is that true?
I would say not specifically on that one. What we have done is a couple of things. Is number one, we have overtly said that we support a reform-minded chief. We have number two said that we are strongly opposed to a racist head of a federation, police federation, who has been toxic. And we've said that, and I think Shauna did it well, that we need dramatic change. We also are creating the space for over the next year, when these conversations take place, we want ourselves to be at the center of creating that space. We're working with the University of Minnesota, which may be our content and research partner on that as well, to be that. And so I think if you take the whole continuum of policing from highly force-based to absolutely none, everything in between the two absolute extremes will be things that we'll be talking about and creating space for.
Yeah, I mean, my only addition is that our work on increased accountability in policing did not start when George Floyd was murdered. We funded the table at the state on how to decrease the number of deadly encounters of police, what policies and what structures are barriers to that. And we came forward with 28 recommendations. And so again, we funded that table. I sat at that table. And I think many of the policy recommendations that are in there actually align with many of the things that people that say defund the police, which based on my listening and understanding actually means a reduction of funding. And we're not focused on funding, we're focused on outcome. We're focused on increased accountability. We're focused on policies that work for communities and policies that stop brown and black men from getting shot, brown and black women from getting shot, and officers getting away with that. And so, I think that if we stay there, I don't think, there might be, and we know that there are people that disagree with that position, but our position is that should not happen.
Okay. So, but that you've sort of been public about and been, you've put out for is it a statement? Is it?
I don't think, we were talking just before we came on about how statements are helpful, but actions are more important. So I think we've been very public about it. I think our situation's a little unique just because of the history both Shauna and I have had in different ways. I have a piece that came out this morning in the Atlantic where I talked a lot about how progressive politicians should look at unions. That is written as a CEO of a foundation, but really as an ex-mayor. And so we're trying to keep those lines a little separate, but not really. We think that's one of the tools that we have. Shauna led an organization that was on the ground with Somali, Latino, and African-American families in a very direct way. I was the mayor of the city, so we're throwing that into the table. But generally, we stand for dramatic change and creating the space to have that conversation without tearing the city apart.
Mm-hmm. And Deborah, I think the point that I hope we're taking away is that it's not about a statement, it's about actions. Our actions happened before George Floyd, and specifically related to this issue was when we funded the table that looked over the last year at how to decrease police-involved deadly incidents. And so we want to make sure that we are congruent with what we are saying with what we are doing. And I think the demonstration of the doing is allowing for us to be in the conversation in this moment.
Great, that's really helpful. All right, last question. And I don't see Mary Jo Herbig from Flint, Michigan. What light are you seeing in this moment?
Yeah, you take that one, RT.
There have been some really dark moments. Here's what is making me whole and happy we're in this moment. A man is dead. It is a hideous, hideous, hideous act that killed him. And it was done by the people's servant. And it just, I can't get over that, and I don't want to say anything positive without landing that really seriously. We didn't have to have this to wake up, but the world is in a very different place about this, and I think that is hugely important. We are having the disruptive conversations that we need to have. We have seen, everybody's heard about the horrible murder, and everybody's heard about the burning. You haven't heard a whole lot about the most important thing happening, is there is a mass mobilization of people across geography, across race, who are out there protesting, demanding action. And that wind in the sails, I know from having sat in the mayor's office, without that wind in the sails, with as much wind saying put more cops and more force out on this street, now there's this huge wind in our sails. So I believe this is the moment to grab this. I don't think this is the same as every other incident. And it's not just because it happened here. It is something really different. And we in community foundations are exactly dead center. So I would much rather be here with the responsibility we all feel on our shoulders than to be watching this stuff on TV.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm going to lead the answer of this question and just be really explicit. Like, as a Black woman, I feel like the hope in this moment is also the sadness in the moment. And I think it goes to RT talking about kind of the multicultural sort of response to this, is that I am watching a lot of people waking up to an issue around systemic issues, around policing, that has been repeatedly yelled out from communities of color and urban communities for decades. And I am watching people that I have worked with that have been working on equity literally wake up in this moment. So it gives me great hope that now they're awake. And hopefully they do something with their new perspective, their new lens, their new commitment. It also makes me really sad to think about how kind of the erasure of those experiences, the minimization of those experiences have been going on for far too long. And so I think that if everyone that is engaged stays engaged, I think if, you know, the foundations that are on this call and beyond are looking at where they need to evolve to be more centered in community and in justice, if we actually act into the moment, I have no doubt that we will have a different tomorrow than we have today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for both answering that question. So I really want to thank both of you for sharing what you have today, and to all of you who participated and took some time out of your incredibly demanding days. I mean, you just keep getting hit with one thing after another, and community foundations have really been stepping up. So we are, we've been hosting these webinars for several months now, and there won't be a webinar on July 2nd, and we're going to send out a survey to get your feedback and input on future webinars. Are there topics? How often we should do this? But we'd really like your feedback on that for all of you who are attending this. So we're really, really grateful for how much you've continued to stay engaged. So stay tuned for a webinar so that we can, stay tuned for a survey so we can get a better sense of how we can meet your needs. Finally, we'd like to end with a Lucille Clifton poem. Normally my colleague Len Bartel is the poem reader, but he's unable to be with us today, so I'll read the poem today. Won't you celebrate with me? Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and failed. So thanks everyone. Thanks RT and Shonda. Thanks for those of you who submitted questions. And have a great couple of weeks. Take care.
Thank you.